Let me out. Osrith screamed again by the bars of the gates. Since the weak dawnlight, Osrith had shouted. At first, the guards were alerted, and approached as she called in Cymric, Anglish and, if Grioghair was still there, Gaelish. Shout again, a voice called from the monastery, and you will have no food or water this day. Send me Grioghair MacDougall. Osrith changed her shout, but this time, there was no reply. Her clothing looked worse in the daylight. She awoke with Eric looking at her, and she curled herself up inside her cloak, turning her back to him. Osrith was angry. Yet, no one came, not Grioghair, not True, nor even yet Guthred. Eric was let out of the cell, chained, that by two nervous-looking guards. Osrith glanced over to them, as he pulled on his boots, considering whether to making a run for it. But she was neither armed nor had silver. When a servant came with some food, he accompanied by a guard. They called Eric over and handed him bread and ale. None for Osrith. The servant, probably a heathen, at least had the decency to look sorry. They want me weak, Osrith thought, neither moving nor speaking. Like her uncle treated prisoners at Bibbenberg, weaker prisoners were more likely to confess, or at least, die quietly. What do you know of Harthknutson? Eric asked, offering Osrith a of his bread. Without shame, she took it, taking little bites, a technique Glimry had once explained, had used when they were lightened of most of their food one winter by Ivar. A weak puppet for the Saxons, Osrith replied, dismissively. Good-looking, is he not? Eric grinned, goading her. Now your husband is gone. You married him then, Osrith replied, grateful of the ale that the Norseman offered to her, too, trying not to think of tagged. Eric threw back his head and laughed. I'd rather marry his sister, he mused. Is his sister beautiful? Yes, he conceded, looking interestedly at Osrith. She was, promised in marriage to a lord of Bibbenberg. Osrith froze, but said nothing. Or, so the abbot tells me. But she never married him and ran off with a Dane. He looked at Osrith with very blue eyes. Why not give in to Guthred? You will be released from here, he will treat you well. You will be a queen. I am a Gaelish warrior, Osrith replied. I wish to fight for my king. Forever. A king who has abandoned you? Who arranged for your marriage as an alliance? Osrith didn't reply. Instead, she stared at the bars again. It is Grioghair, I am certain. The Scot? I killed a kinsman of his. For he was creeping, like a thief, with his men to Domhnall on Iona. When Osrith stood, hand in sword, on a battlefield over Grioghair, at a time in the future, she would think on that point again. Honest men, she would reflect, as the tip of Buay would score Grioghair's jugular, are welcomed as such. Osrith handed back the jar to Eric, who drained the last of it. Then, she moved across to the cell's door, knees to chin, arms wrapped around them, the woolen blanket tucked in where cold might creep, looking out to the courtyard for clues and opportunities. For she was determined to be at liberty as soon as she possibly could. Eric sat for most of the afternoon in silence too. Osrith wondered what the Dane was thinking about. He spoke of honor, so he was unlikely to wish to escape too. After a time, he got to his feet and moved to the corner of the cell, dropped his breeches and took a piss. Osrith looked away and back to the courtyard. Little had changed, little had happened since the day before. The horses were on their winter food. If Guthred had intended to join Domhnall immediately, they would be eating hay and being exercised. As darkness fell outside, Osrith suddenly got to her feet. Someone she knew was treading her way across the courtyard. I found these, she said, breathlessly as she pushed them through the bars. Have you eaten? Father thinks you are awfully brave. She said this in Cymric and Osrith replied in kind. Thank you. There was bread and, surprisingly, wrapped up in a thin cloth, fish, plus boil's water in a stone jar. Osrith's eyes opened wide as she saw it all. Dialogue for a cariad, Osrith said, taking Half's little hand. You need your strength. and Osrith suspected she knew what the girl meant, for she had insisted in feeding Osrith at risk to herself and her father if she were discovered. Osrith wondered whether she could ask her, and decided that she would. "In my clothing, in the scriptorium, in the pocket," Osrith began. "Was the lily root," she wanted to continue. "Boil it well and bring it to me, and take the silver, also in a pocket for yourself." For Osrith knew she needed its scouring ability. Constantine's, it could be no other. But Haf's answer made Osrith's heart sink. "All gone," she said, big eyes shining up to Osrith. "Taken." "My clothes?" She nodded. "My sword?" Haf nodded again. "Where?" "I could not say, for I do not know," she said. Osrith looked away. "Taken." "My clothes, my sword." "Can you search?" But she had gone too far, and Haf slunk from the bars and left, slowly, walking sedately across the courtyard. Osrith looked down into her lap. How lucky she was to have a friend such as Haf, to have brought her food such as this. She was aware that Eric was looking at her. "Here," Osrith said, in English. She offered the cloth to Eric. He looked at the fish but shook his head. "It was brought to you, by a friend, it would seem. She likes you." Not getting the Northman's meaning, Osrith nodded, breaking off the bread and using the crust to scoop up the beautiful herring. "Is toil limskidden," she told the herring, vaguely, telling it Sbe liked the taste of it. Her heart suddenly soared as she thought of Tagged and what she suspected was germinating within her. She could be wrong, but would have taken the root, to be sure. "What did you wish the girl to do for you?" Eric asked. Osrith drew her blanket around herself, biting more of the bread. "That is my business," she replied defensively. Then, after the food began to warm her stomach, conceded, "I wanted my clothes, my actual breeches and jerkin, my boots. My sword." She reached for the stone jar with the water in. "Gone. Taken. By those who wish to curb you here?" "That would make sense," Osrith replied. "Who taught you to fight?" he asked. "The king's household guard. His general. Saynid." The man's face appeared in her mind. She would stand by him again, and fight, of that she was determined. "I was awarded a place in the king's household," Osrith continued, "when I saved his son from the bastard Nor." She broke off. "Some bastard Norse, who were choosing to raise Dunota," she added. Eric laughed. "It was not us. But we are bastards, otherwise we would not gain land. Have the Saxons never done the same?" "They did exactly the same, when the Britons owned this land. When my ancestors were rulers here." It felt refreshing to say that aloud. Even growing up, when the stories were told, even in her uncle's presence, Urien of Vcht was esteemed. She wished she could have found out more of her mother, Jaitha's life. She would be of one of the noble families, who were the warriors here. She supposed she would never know now. "You speak many languages," Eric continued. "I do not speak Danish though, as you can tell." "Tak," Osrith added, to which the Northman laughed. "Tabog Vindm Sam signed," Eric said. "Win or lose with the same mind." "Tabog Vindm Sam me signed," Osrith repeated. "You speak as a Saxon," Eric remarked. "An angle," Osrith clarified. "Like Norse and Danes, different but the same. Like Cymri and Gales, different but the same." She drained the jug and leaned over to the cell's iron gates, placing the jug onto the cold, hard stone and folding up the thin cloth in which the herring had been wrapped. "Have you a child?" Eric asked suddenly. Osrith stopped as she drew back from the cell bars, and turned to look at the Northman in the gloom. "Is that why you so desire to reach your husband?" "I once grown a child, a little," Osrith admitted, as she wrapped herself back up in the blanket, trying to find the warmest place in amongst the dank straw. "It wasn't my path, it seems. God has other ideas." "Your God wishes you to be a warrior?" "Yes. I am good at it. If men do not wish to be warriors, they must fight all the same. Women should accept their place. Women can still die by a sword. It is why Osrith broke off. So easy was this Northman to talk to, she had nearly admitted where she came from. Why, you're nothing, Osrith replied. And Eric said nothing more. Little changed the next day. No one came to Osrith, but Half brought her food shortly after a guard brought some for Eric. Again, he was let out for exercise, and this was when Half crept back to Osrith. Here, she whispered, as she pushed another stone jar towards her. As you asked. Lily root water, Osrith thought, then thought about her route back to Dunnottar, imagining as intricate a journey as possible to distract her from the bitter taste. You have my clothes? My sword? But Half shook her head. I paid a healer for the route. Osrith reached to the girl's hand. You are a very good friend, and I do not deserve it. Half smiled, but again said nothing before slipping away as Eric returned. The weather grew colder, and Osrith's days were taken up with talking to Eric, who was teaching her Norse words, and pushing down the envy of his hour away from the cell. She used the time to relieve herself in peace, and had seen no evidence of the lily root's efficacy. A germ of life was not growing in her. For that, and for the hot water Half brought to her regularly, Osrith was profoundly grateful. Eric was also good company. He told Osrith of his life in Norway, where the weather was far colder than here. They taught one another languages. Norse and Danish were broadly interchangeable, and she learned Manakvind and some similar words as English. It was amazing that more words were not known, but the Norse and Danes spoke so quickly and pronounced those which were similar so differently. Osrith could understand why. A week before Christmas, Half came one evening as Eric was discussing the Norse gods, and Osrith mentioned this to Half. She proceeded to explain in Cymric about the gods, which Osrith translated, then whispered. The church added their story to ours. They were good Christians at first. But the Saxon Christians tried to make us forget. Her eyes were bright, as she told Osrith, as if her words were dangerous, which they probably were. But my mother remembered, and told us. She was out to death by the abbot before true, Abbot Eardred, as an example, my father said. Her face crinkled, and she looked down. Osrith reached out both her hands to the girl. And, for once in long time, she remembered Beatha, and Finn, her little son, and thought how Half was like them. It is midwinter next week, Osrith said, soothingly. Midwinter, Eric repeated, recognizing the word. July. Yule? Osrith asked, then turned back to Half. You will eat and drink when it's midwinter, Osrith said. Your father will cook a feast. She nodded, then leaned towards Osrith, kissing her on the cheek. Osrith blushed in the semi-darkness as she watched the girl leave. She likes you, Eric laughed. I'm not a man. So? Norse women, Danish women, they often like one another, with not a man. Osrith looked back towards the hall door through which Half had vanished. At least someone does. I do, too, Eric remarked. You are a noble person. Honorable. He shifted from where he was and DRW a little closer to Osrith. You did not eat the meat she brought you? No, Osrith said, offering Eric the tin plate. Tack, Eric thanked her, taking a bite of the meat. We had a sister once, like you, though a little younger. So full of life, all loud and alive. Then one day our crops got blight. It was damper season than usual. Many farmers starved and she died. Siegfried and I were away, we had gone Viking. He sighed, and took another bite. Ma, there was a shadow of herself. We want land, here, to bring our families to. To Northumbria? To Alba? Osrith scoffed. It is poor land here. Eventually Wessex, Eric replied, shrewdly. Guthrum got what he wanted by becoming a Christian, as Guthred has done. They got land, power. No settled Dane or Northman will ever leave. Neither the Angles nor Saxons, though the Cymri nor Gales would clear Key like that. And nor they, for they displaced a people before them. She looked across to Eric, passing the stone jar Half had bought. He took it and drank, spraying a lot of it back out of his mouth. What's this? Vand, Osrith said. DWR, Uish. Water. Eric said, disgusted. Not all. not ale, Osrith agreed. Alba is better than Denmark? Than Norway. It is rich. Eirik put down the jar and, from his hair, pulled a jewel, a pearl, embedded in a silver slide. The pearl glimmered in the half-light. These come from far away, traded many times. But this? He passed the silver clip to Osrith. The river that empties by Lindisfarne. The two-eyed, Osrith replied, looking at the small, shimmery white gem. It was in the river. In the two-eyed. It was the first thing I found when I landed here. It was glimmering between the rocks within two shells in which it had formed. Osrith held it on the flat of her palm, giving it back to him. So what is Guthred's motivation? Osrith asked. Land and riches for Guthred, as for Guthrum. But what has he to gain from allying with Domhnall? It does not seem to be purely hatred of Eochaid which drives him. I do not know. They both fell silent, as the wind began to whip up a storm outside. As Eirik began to get as comfortable as was possible in the straw, Osrith drew hers around her. Godnat, Eirik said, and soon his breathing was heavy as he drifted to sleep. Osrith closed her eyes too, murmuring, Godnat in reply. And was awoken to the sound of the lock of the cell being opened by someone trying to be as quiet as possible. It was night, no moon shone and a wind blew around the courtyard and onto the cell. Osrith listened. 2 or possibly 3 people were outside. Do not worry, said one voice. Guthred is along with us. Strathclyde and Cumbraland reuniting and with Picts. When the Gaels have been driven away, we will reclaim our land. Muzzily, Osrith listened. Some of the conversation was now muffled. She couldn't make sense of the words, and blinked, trying to listen. More shuffling, and more discussion. Then, one of the men spoke clearly. Osrith sat up, in horror. Guthred has departed to Eothwick. He can be no one's alliance, not Domhnall, not yours, Giric. The speaker had Osrith's attention. Giric, Eochaid's ally, here? She shuffled closer. She recognized the voice. But, it was too late to move. Into the cell, in the light of a torch, strode Grioghair. Before she could cry out, he thrust a rag to her mouth, holding her by her hair. Hold her, true. Grioghair demanded, as Osrith struggled, and the abbot thrust his hands around her, dislodging her blanket. Eirik still slept as Osrith fought. True's nimble hands hid her hips, then her waist, before working his way to her breasts. A sliding of cloth came from Grioghair, and Osrith kicked out when she felt his naked leg by her own. He has not rejected her, you cannot despoil her. True's voice was broken between breaths and Osrith felt a lump on the back of her leg. She struggled as True began to squeeze her breasts between his fingers. Can I not? Osrith felt another lump by her leg. No. Insisted True, finding her nipples. His fingers fumbled as he breathed unsteadily by her neck. You wish to do it, True, Grioghair accused, as a scream like an egg being relieved came from Abbot True's mouth, who reeled from Osrith, letting go of her tits. Oh God in heaven, Giric! Moaned True, in Cymric and Osrith, taking advantage of the otherwise occupied True, whose seed she could smell behind her, to kick Grioghair. You! She shouted, jetting free of the gag. You! You lied, Ted. She was sure of it. So many things suggested the alliance between Domhnall and Guthred was other than it was made out to be. And a Priapic abbot had confirmed it. Grioghair was Giric, Alba's joint monarch with Eochaid. Unless you are deposed. She tried another hypothesis. Yes. Grioghair replied, thrusting his hands on her body. Yes, I killed. And I nearly had the boys Domhnall and Constantine and Glashku, except Eochaid would not allow me to do so. True. Leave us. He hissed, as the abbot scrambled in the straw behind her. You really must not. Must not what? Grioghair asked, with deliberate slowness. Tell me, True? Touch her body? He grabbed Osrith, who flailed her arms as he pushed beyond the fabric and pressed his fingers to her flesh. Must not hold her ass and squeeze it with my hands. I will say I will marry Guthred, Osrith said, suddenly. If it means Cumbraland will ally with Strathclyde. Grioghair stopped, and said nothing for a time. Then, he stepped away. Truly. It wasn't a question. I am of Cumbraland. Osrith tried to sound earnest. I found out, in the records. If you would leave me, tell Guthred I would be honored to be his wife. It is ... written, True said from beside her, panting a little to recover his breath. It would be well ... they were married in reality as well ... as on ... paper. A long pause followed, before Grioghair spoke. Very well, Grioghair, Garrick said. Osrith heard him take a step backwards. Should that we take you out of here, and you go to Guthred, will you keep your silence? Yes, Osrith lied. She had no intention of being married to Guthred, and as soon as she could she would get a message to Domhnall that Grioghair was Garrick, Eochaid's man. But ... you were not the Garrick we met at Glashku. The words fell from Osrith's mouth before she could stop them. Domhnall believes what he wants to believe, Grioghair replied. He believes me a traitor to Eochaid. I hid at Glashku, a servant took my place. But I heard every word of his plan, which was why I had him murdered. Enough. Hissed True. She has said she will comply. The cell door closed with a faint cling. Osrith exhaled deeply.